In recent years, Argentina has faced economic and social challenges. High inflation, rising poverty, and a visible crisis in the capital, where poverty and misery are increasing at alarming levels. Outlying neighborhoods are dominated by drug traffickers who dominate the streets, and violence is part of everyday life. Clashes with the police and disputes between gangs are part of the routine. Here on the channel, we've already shown how Cubans live in this scenario of poverty and scarcity. So, after watching this one, be sure to check it out and prepare yourself for a reality that many people can't even imagine. But what if I told you that Buenos Aires was once synonymous with wealth and modernity? Just over 100 years ago, it was called the Paris of South America. Paris of South America, a city that breathed elegance, luxury, and innovation. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Argentine capital attracted immigrants, artists, and investors from all over the world. Exuberant palaces, avenues inspired by Paris, cafés full of intellectuals, and a port teeming with opportunities. What made Buenos Aires reach this level? What was everyday life like for the people? What happened to make it fade away? Today, we're going to travel back in time to the Argentine Belle Époque, when tango took over the streets. Cafés were the center of social life, and neighborhoods seemed like an extension of Europe. If you like history and want to understand what Buenos Aires was like in its heyday, stick around because what follows will surprise you. To understand how Buenos Aires earned the nickname of the Paris of Latin America, we need to go back to the 1900s. At the time, the city was a veritable melting pot of culture, luxury, and contrasts. But this didn't come out of nowhere. At the end of the 19th century, Argentina had been facing turbulent times since its independence in 1816. There were politicians who advocated a strong government in the capital, while regional leaders wanted more autonomy for their provinces. Between them, generals and big landowners fought over the money that passed through the port of Buenos Aires, the country's main port of entry and exit for goods. Whoever controlled this piece of the pie controlled the national economy. This dispute lasted until the 1800s, when Buenos Aires was federalized. In practice, the city was administered directly by the national government and officially became the capital. From then on, everything changed. The driving force behind this transformation was the economy. Argentina was at its peak as an agricultural power. The Pampas produced grains and beef in gigantic quantities, and industrialized Europe needed food. The country took advantage of this demand and began exporting wheat, meat, and leather on a large scale, becoming increasingly wealthy. And guess where this wealth passed through? Through the port of Buenos Aires. With this money, wealthy families and the government itself decided to dress up the city in European style. Grand avenues, monumental buildings, and palaces inspired by Parisian architecture began to sprout up. Avenida de Mayo, for example, connected the Casa Rosada, the seat of government, to the newly built National Congress, forming a corridor of imposing buildings and elegant cafes. Modern lighting, electric streetcars, and, from 1913, the first metro in Latin America, completed the scene of modernity. And we'll talk about all this luxury later. But the city wasn't just being shaped by the rich. While the elite were transforming Buenos Aires into a showcase of luxury and modernity, another movement was taking place. The city was receiving a huge influx of immigrants. Italians, Spaniards, French, Germans, and many others disembarked daily at the port, all with the same dream: to make America. Newspapers of the time printed advertisements promising opportunities in Argentina, selling the illusion of a country full of work and prosperity. But when they arrived, the reality was much harsher. The port was buzzing with carts, streetcars, and people from all over, and in the midst of the chaos, many realized that life would not be as easy as they had imagined. With so many cultures mixing, the neighborhoods began to change. The Italians, for example, made a strong presence in La Boca and San Telmo, bringing their vibrant colors, cuisine, and, unintentionally, leaving their mark on the Argentine accent, that sung Spanish that has become a typical feature of Buenos Aires. La Boca, in fact, became famous for its wooden houses painted with leftover ship's paint, forming that explosion of colors that we still see today on the Caminito. But despite the unique look, living conditions were precarious. The workers shared cramped tenements without basic sanitation and with communal kitchens. The space was small, but this also strengthened bonds of solidarity and helped popular culture to flourish. It was in this environment that the city's great passions were born. In La Boca, for example, Boca Juniors was founded in 1905, and it wasn't long before the neighborhood also became one of the cradles of tango. At first, this music was marginalized and played in brothels and popular bars, but gradually it conquered the heart of the city. Meanwhile, in the center and in neighborhoods like Montserrat, Balvanera, and Retiro, the atmosphere was different. There, the bourgeoisie frequented refined cafés, drank hot chocolate, discussed politics, and, of course, wore clothes straight from Paris. And if there was one neighborhood that breathed sophistication, it was Recoleta. Walking through its streets was like strolling through a miniature Paris. Sumptuous mansions, manicured gardens, and grand architectural buildings set the scene. The greatest symbol of this refinement was the construction of the Teatro Colón, officially inaugurated in 1908. The theater soon became a world reference for operas and concerts, and its acoustics are still considered one of the best on the planet. It was a stage that attracted European artists and showed that Buenos Aires wanted to position itself as a major cultural center. European influence was everywhere. The city's architects were mostly French and Italian. The furniture and fabrics came straight from Paris. Even the patisseries tried to reproduce the charm of French patisseries. And if there was one place where all this luxury and modernity was concentrated, it was Avenida de Mayo. Avenida de Mayo was born to impress. Inspired by the boulevards of Paris, its imposing facades, monumental domes, and elegant buildings formed the axis that linked the Casa Rosada to the National Congress. To walk along it at the beginning of the 20th century was to plunge into the heart of the Buenos Aires elite. Sophisticated cafés, European patisseries, luxurious theaters, and five-star hotels made the avenue a must-see. One of the most iconic cafés was Café Tortoni, founded at the end of the 19th century, but which became a real cultural hub in the following years. There, writers, musicians, and politicians spent hours discussing ideas or simply showing off for high society. It was a Buenos Aires that wanted to show itself to the world. And modernity wasn't just about looks. The city was the first in Latin America to have a subway, inaugurated in 1913, connecting Avenida de Mayo to more distant neighborhoods. The electric streetcar also cut through the streets, making it easier to get around the city. But modernity was not restricted to the center. Neighborhoods like Almagro, Balvanera, and Once were buzzing with an intense mix of cultures. Small shops, factories, workshops, and markets formed a mosaic where Italian seamstresses, Jewish tailors, empanada sellers, and workers from different backgrounds shared space. In the north, areas like Retiro and Recoleta maintained an aristocratic feel with tree-lined streets, exclusive social clubs, and grand mansions. The Recoleta Cemetery, for example, became an attraction in its own right, with its luxurious mausoleums that looked like palaces for the dead. But while European influence dominated in the center and in the noble neighborhoods, in other parts of the city the reality was quite different. In the south, the reality was different. In neighborhoods like Barracas and Parque Patricios, the scene was dominated by factories and meatpacking plants. The workers faced exhausting working hours and low wages. Many barely saw the color of their money. At the end of the working day, thousands of tired workers crowded the streetcar stops, telling stories about their boss, their fight for better conditions, or their relative who had just arrived from Europe and was still trying to settle down. With so much inequality, it wasn't long before tensions arose. Many immigrants arrived from Europe with anarchist and socialist ideas, which quickly spread to the unions and mutual aid associations. Buenos Aires became a political melting pot, where strikes became increasingly frequent. But the government, controlled by the agrarian and commercial elite, didn't want to talk and responded with repression. In 1909, the so-called Red Week ended in violence when demonstrators were harshly repressed by the police. But nothing compared to what was to follow. In 1919, Tragic Week turned the city into a battlefield. The metalworkers' strike turned into an uprising, and the government reacted with brutality. The result? Hundreds of dead, wounded, and a deep scar in Argentine history. While some danced in luxurious balls, others faced the police in the streets, asking for the basics: decent wages, better working conditions, and rights that today seem obvious, but which at the time were treated as a threat. Even in this climate of tension, there was something that united the different social strata: culture. And few things represented this mix better than the tango. Believe it or not, tango was not well regarded by conservative society at first. It was born in the tenements and brothels of neighborhoods like La Boca, San Telmo, and Barracas, mixing European, African, and native rhythms. At first, it was seen as the music of marginalized people, a kind of cursed style that was only played in the ghettos and bars frequented by immigrants and sailors. But time showed that tango was much bigger than that. Little by little, it gained a foothold in the city's cafés and reached the middle classes. With its melancholy rhythm and lyrics that spoke of suffering loves, betrayals, and longing, the tango became the soundtrack of Buenos Aires at the time. And when Carlos Gardel appeared on the music scene, the story changed for good. His charisma and voice made tango explode not only in Argentina, but all over the world. Within a few years, the tango was already being danced in the salons of high society and was crossing the Atlantic, becoming a hit even in Paris. It was a cultural phenomenon like no other. If Buenos Aires had previously tried to imitate Europe, now it was Europe that was surrendering to a rhythm born in the streets of Buenos Aires. Soccer followed a similar path. Boca Juniors, born in La Boca, became the people's team, while River Plate, which started out in the same neighborhood but later moved to a more upscale area, attracted a different audience. It wasn't long before soccer became an overwhelming passion, and Sundays were transformed into giant events, with fervent fans, neighborhood rivalries, and a sense of belonging that went beyond sport. And where did these people gather to debate, meet, and experience this pulsating Buenos Aires? In the cafés. The Café Tortoni, which we mentioned earlier, was the meeting place for intellectuals, where politicians, journalists, and poets spent hours discussing the future of the country. In Almagro, small cafes were filled with Italian immigrants singing songs from their homeland. In San Telmo, the simplest cafe concerts brought together musicians who, between sips of wine, would release the first chords of an improvised tango. And the city devoured information. Newspapers were sold on every street corner, with morning, afternoon, and even Sunday editions. The headlines talked about everything: strikes, elections, advertisements for houses for rent, and of course the great cultural events that made Buenos Aires shine. For the elite, the great symbol of sophistication was the Teatro Colón. Construction began at the end of the 19th century, and it was officially inaugurated in 1908. It soon became one of the most important theaters in the world. Russian dancers, European orchestras, and opera stars crossed the ocean to perform there. And Buenos Aires society loved to flaunt this status. For them, the Colón was proof that Buenos Aires was on a par with the great European capitals. But despite its growth and wealth, the city was full of contrasts. Each neighborhood had its own way, its own accent, and its own identity. Palermo was beginning to grow, with luxurious houses and large parks like Parque 3 de Febrero. La Boca continued to thrive with port life and small fishing businesses. Belgrano, once a summer village, became a residential neighborhood, attracting upper-middle-class families who preferred to stay further away from the center. Barracas, on the other hand, was geared towards industry, and its daily life was marked by the noise of trains loaded with goods. This mosaic of cultures and realities made Buenos Aires a unique city. And of course, politics continued to boil. Until 1912, the oligarchy controlled the elections with an iron fist, but the Sáenz-Peña law brought important changes. It guaranteed the secret and compulsory vote for men. This is how, in 1916, Hipólito Yrigoyen became president, breaking the domination of the traditional elite. This strengthened strikes, protests, and workers' participation in politics. Inequality did not disappear, but workers had more space to demand their rights. Buenos Aires became a battleground between the oligarchy trying to hold on to power and the unions and parties demanding change. Even in the midst of so much tension, Buenos Aires' Belle Époque flourished. Books were launched, intellectuals discussed philosophy in cafés, musicians experimented with fusions of rhythms, and the tango exploded in popularity. In the salons of Palermo and Recoleta, the elite danced waltzes and polkas. In the suburbs, milonga and tango dominated the evenings. At the time, everything seemed possible. The city was growing fast, exports guaranteed a prosperous economy, and Buenos Aires saw itself as the capital of Latin America. Buenos Aires' pride was at its peak. But time showed that this optimism wouldn't last forever. The First World War had already affected exports somewhat, but it was in the 1920s and 1930s that things really went off the rails. The economy began to wobble, inflation soared, political conflicts intensified, and military coups became frequent. The stability of the golden era was behind us. But none of this erases the brilliance that Buenos Aires had in its Belle Époque. Those were years of cultural effervescence, accelerated growth, and a city that seemed to combine the best of Europe and South America in one place. A time of luxury, inequality, revolutions, and dreams. A Buenos Aires that, for a moment, believed it was at the center of the world. So, did you enjoy this dive into Buenos Aires at the beginning of the century? Did you already know all this history of growth, luxury, and social contrasts? Let us know in the comments what surprised you the most, or which neighborhood you'd most like to visit. If you liked this content, leave a like, share it with your friends who love history, and don't forget to subscribe to Bello Mundo to keep up to date with everything about cultures, destinations, and curiosities in a world full of surprises. Thank you very much for following along, and see you on our next adventure.